Hey everybody, this is Eugene Leisure here. Welcome to Forensics Talks. This is episode number 23. Just a couple of quick announcements as usual. And the first one is that there is a Cloud Compare course that's going to be coming up on March 9th and 10th. And so we've already got a bunch of people registered for that. But if you're using any type of 3D technology, if you are using photogrammetry or laser scanning, and you want to know how to do more outside of this or your native software, and you want to use this open source software, Cloud Compare, it's really fantastic. And if you want to register for that, just go to my website, ai2-3d.com, go to the training page, and you'll see some more information to that regard. Also, there is the Association of Crime Scene Reconstruction Conference that's coming up next week, actually. So March 2nd to the 4th. I'll be speaking on the 4th, but I will be attending that conference virtually. It is in person and virtually. Still time to sign up. If you're interested, head over to acer.org and you can just sign up there and decide if you want to drive there or attend it virtually. Okay. And I think that's all I have to say. And I think we're going to get started right into our next guest. And today the topic is going to be ethics in forensics. And for this, I have a very esteemed guest. His name is Brady Fischer. A lot of you know him online. I would say he's almost somewhat of a celebrity in forensic science. He's very well known. Brady Fischer grew up in the Bronx in New York, and he received his Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from the City College of New York. He holds a Master of Science degree in chemistry from Purdue University and an MBA degree from California State University, Northridge. He began his career in criminalistics with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Crime Lab in 1969 and became the crime lab director from 1987 until his retirement in 2009. Brady Fischer is a member of many organizations. He's a distinguished fellow and past president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences and was awarded the Academy's highest award, the Gradwell Medallion. He served as president of the International Association of Forensic Sciences, president of the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, and a past chairman of the American Society of Crime Lab Directors, the Laboratory Accreditation Board. He's a founding director and served on the board of directors for the National Forensic Science Technology Center from 1995 until 2007. And Barry has been invited to speak all over the world at conferences and talking about lab practices, quality assurance, and related topics. In 2000, he led a forensic science delegation to lecture to forensic scientists in China. In 2017, he was invited to be a guest plenary speaker at a forensic science conference in Dubai. His textbook, Techniques of Crime Scene Investigation, is in its 8th edition, and he's co-author of 2 other books, Forensics Demystified and Introduction to Criminalistics, The Foundation of Forensic Science. Since retiring, Barry has consulted for the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the United States Department of Justice, and he regularly consults on matters of forensic science. His current interests, though, concern interrelationships between forensic science and the law, along with public policy issues concerning the timely delivery of quality forensic support services to the criminal justice system. Today, though, Barry's going to share his knowledge and experience with respect to ethics in forensics. So let me bring him in here. Hey, Barry, how you doing? Thank you for being here today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. I wasn't kidding. I heard about you before I actually met you. So, and I know you're quite active online too, and you regularly post some, interesting articles related to forensic science. And I think I believe we first met in person at was the ACER conference in Tacoma, and it's getting on now a few years. So,
right.
Yeah. So. First off, you have a very long career, and it's great to see that you're very active even today, even being retired. I don't know if it's one of those things where you can't sit still, but that's good for you. Good on you, for sure. I want to ask you about your initial interest in forensic science before you were in university and what prompted you to move in that particular direction.
I always describe it as a serendipitous moment. Truth be told, I didn't even know what forensic science was until it kind of smacked me in the face. I finished a master's degree. I was living in Los Angeles and looking for a job, and I literally stumbled on an opportunity with the LA County Sheriff's Department, who was having a bear of a problem dealing with drug cases. They were coming out the door, and so they had to hire more chemists. So I applied and was chosen. And initially, it was an uncomfortable fit coming from a university background and being tossed into a law enforcement background. It just was kind of didn't quite fit right. But over time, I just literally fell in love with it. And a couple of years in, I decided this was it for me. This is where I want to spend the rest of my professional career.
Wow. Okay. Well, you have a very distinguished career. You also do a lot of management type talks, right? You talk about how to manage labs and that sort of thing. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So you've seen firsthand, with respect to our topic today, dealing with people regularly is not always the easiest thing, especially when somebody comes up through the chain of command and they're doing the hands-on work and the grunt work, and then all of a sudden they move into a position of management. I think one of the biggest challenges for a person like that is they could be an excellent technician or scientist or whatever, but then when you have to deal with people and some of the related issues, that can be troublesome and cause some issues.
That's exactly right. When I was studying chemistry in college and grad school, these matters were never even discussed, and it was a bit of a shock to the system to wind up being in charge of various units and trying to make things happen where you didn't have that hands-on approach where you were doing it yourself. You had to rely on other people to do. And the curious thing I always felt was during my career, I supervised, managed both civilian personnel and police personnel. And the police were in some ways very easy because they were used to an authoritative chain of command. And when you said to do something or asked to do something, they did it. With the civilian personnel, they would oftentimes push back and say, well, why would you want to do that? Mm-hmm. So it did present challenges. Sometimes I got it right, and plenty of times I did not.
Yeah. So over your career, have you seen an increased emphasis on ethics, or how was it, for example, when you started versus maybe what somebody might experience today?
When I started, it was kind of in the background. I initially belonged to one professional group called the California Association of Criminalists, who has a very extensive code of professional conduct, a code of ethics. So these concepts were out there, but they weren't really pushed to any great degree. I had a couple of early instances where I opted to do nothing, even though I probably should have said or done something. I was at a crime scene once, and the detective in charge of the crime scene was with me. I happened to find a capsule of Nembutal, which is a sodium barbiturate, and I showed it to him, and he took it out of my hands and threw it out into the backyard and said, we don't want to muddy up the case by the suggestion that the defendant might have been under the influence of something. And I thought to myself, wow, that's not real. And I really should do something, but I didn't quite know what to do. I also had an instance where a police officer came up to me while I was working on narcotics cases and basically wanted me to falsify evidence. I didn't do it, but I also opted not to follow through and turn him in for even suggesting that, because obviously it was wrong. I ultimately came up with my own notion of what ethical conduct was. And it went something like this. How would I react if the story wound up on the front page of my local newspapers? How would I feel to discuss it with my children, my parents, my wife, or friends? And, basically, if it bothers you in a visceral kind of way, it's probably not ethical conduct.
Yeah. I think you called that was it called the headline test? Is that what you called it?
Yep.
The headline
That's exactly
test.
what it is. And I stole that from somebody else. I can't take credit.
Okay. I remember reading it. And actually, well, ethics is a very difficult subject to talk about simply because it is it's hard to be objective about it because it is somewhat subjective. So what is ethical to you may not necessarily be completely, ethical to me. And so that comes from sort of personal experiences, upbringing, and different things like that. And it's obviously a topic which has been debated for thousands of years, the times of the Greeks and the Romans, and then carrying on forward. And now, of course, it makes its way into professional societies. You wrote a chapter in a book called Ethics in Forensic Science. And I went through that, and there's some really good points in that particular chapter that you discuss. And you give some really good examples too of what would be considered unethical. And I think the bottom line here is maybe what you would consider or somebody else would consider to be right or wrong, right? Like you're doing something wrong. It's going to unfairly impact a suspect or a defendant or whatever it might be. And does that make sense? That's a pretty low level definition.
Well, that would be the legalistic definition. There's a case in the States called the Brady Decision, which requires the prosecution to turn over exculpatory evidence to the defense. Now, you can scratch your head about what does exculpatory evidence mean. I asked a friend of mine who is a law school professor. I said, "Well, what does it mean?" And he gave me the pithy answer. He said, "Well, it depends." I said, "That sounds like an adult diaper answer. What is it?" And he had the damnedest time trying to explain what exculpatory evidence is. I'll give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you're working in a crime lab and you write a report. And before that report goes out, it's reviewed. And your supervisor finds a mistake that you've made and points it out to you, and you change it. Do you have to tell the prosecutor that or does your supervisor have to tell the prosecutor that this individual made a mistake? And what would happen if it happened on a regular basis? Does that have to be done? We ultimately, in our setting, we ultimately came to the decision that if the mistake was uncovered before the case was reported out, turned over to the prosecution, that was a no harm, no foul situation. If it went out and then we had to call it back, that was a different story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In the chapter that you wrote, you pointed out, fortunately, that these types of instances are actually infrequent, right? It's not like we have a huge problem on our hands where people are running around and misrepresenting evidence and that sort of thing. But what would you say is the most common type of dilemma that a forensic scientist in a lab is facing maybe over and over and over?
Well, people who are not in the sciences often think of it as a black and white construct, that it is either is or isn't. Most of the time, it's right in the middle of the gray. Mm-hmm. And so trying to interpret what it is you've seen in your examination becomes highly problematic. Now, in some cases, it is black and white. You know, if you're doing a drug test, it's heroin or it's not heroin. There's not a great deal of middle ground. On the other hand, if you're doing some sort of comparative analysis, say a toolmark or a bullet comparison, there may not be sufficient data, sufficient information in your observations of the evidence to allow you to form a conclusive opinion. So then you're faced with the dilemma, how do I report out that uncertainty, that lack of clarity? I think that there's something there, but I can't be 100% certain. Let's say I'm 90% certain.
Mm-hmm.
Is this the kind of information that I ought to be presenting to a jury? Because as an expert witness, the chances are that I'm given a lot more credibility than a lay witness. And they might take that 90% certainty as, well, the expert said it's 90%, so it's probably true.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you deal with that? And then layered on top of that is a new phenomenon that Ithiel Dror from the UK has discussed extensively, dealing with cognitive bias, or what happens when you get information that's not directly involved in the examination that you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say the detective said, well, I saw this gun in the defendant's hand, it must be his, and you get the gun and have to do a comparison of the bullets between the body and the gun. And you have the detective's statement ringing in the back of your head saying, it must be him. How does that affect your presentation of information in a courtroom setting or even in your report?
Mm-hmm.
So those are a couple of issues. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of situations that come up from time to time, and sometimes you just have to take a step back, scratch your head, and do some soul searching, even to decide, well, how am I going to deal with this?
Mm-hmm.
What happens when you have a new type of evidence that you hadn't seen before, and you do some straightforward chemical tests, which seem to be substantive to the investigation at hand, but you're not terribly familiar with using them and you haven't been adequately tested? Do you make a report or not? You know,
Mm-hmm.
there are loads of issues that have to be dealt with.
Yeah, there's a paper here that I want to bring up and show others. It's called "Ethical Issues Across Different Fields of Forensic Science," and they bring up some really interesting types or different types of what they would consider to be unethical. And I have to say, some of these are in varying degrees for me. They're not. I can see how, like exactly what you just said. There's a gray area. It's not black and white. But for example, misrepresentation of credentials, that seems to be an obvious one. And I believe that was a case that you had brought up in your chapter, and I'm trying to remember the name of it now, but I believe it was Zane was the last name, Fred Zane.
Right.
And what happened in that one?
Well, Mr. Zane was I believe he was a police officer who worked in the crime lab in West Virginia State Police. And he had obtained some training in forensic serology, blood typing. And this is before the advent of DNA testing. And he pushed the envelope very, very far in making statements that really were unsupportable. He would take he would get an item of evidence with blood stains in various places, say an article of clothing, take out clippings from different places and type them and put all of the results together, suggesting that you could make paint a picture of the individual when, well, in fact, the blood could have come from multiple individuals. What happened there was that there was a hue and cry from the defense bar in West Virginia, saying that this fellow was just not to be believed. He had subsequently left West Virginia and took up a job in Texas. I forget which laboratory down there. And turned out that the prosecutors in West Virginia liked his results so much that they began sending evidence down to Fred in Texas to get the right result, because he always came up with information that was pretty prejudicial to the defendant in these cases. Well, to make a long story short, the West Virginia Supreme Court finally decided to conduct an investigation. They hired a retired Superior Court judge to run it. And I was sitting in my office one day minding my business, and I get a call from West Virginia from the clerk of the court saying, we need some help. At the time, I was chairman of the accreditation board of ASCLD Lab, which is a separate entity from ASCLD. And this fellow said he had tried to find some experts in other areas, and I was one of his last hopes. So I wound up saying, okay, we'll help you out. I sent one of the guys in my lab, and I asked the fellow from the Florida Division of Law Enforcement, FDLE laboratory, he was in Orlando at the time, to fly out to West Virginia and do a deep dive in the case review in these cases that Fred had done. So they issued what was a pretty scathing report saying that this guy totally misrepresented things, and it was a horrific situation. The state, West Virginia, ultimately had to make some serious financial restitutions to people who were erroneously convicted. They actually tried to prosecute Zane on some charges, but in one case, the statute of limitation had run. I think they were trying to get him on perjury. Eventually, it just didn't pan out to charge him in any criminal way, and sadly, unfortunately, he passed away from complications of cancer at some time. But that was for many years, that was the poster child of bad ethical conduct in the forensic discipline.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there are other things that can happen. Like, for example, you had talked about testimony, subjective and objective truth. So, for example, what somebody believes to be true versus what somebody can say is actually true, or, for example, not pointing out what some of the limitations are. Things like advocacy. There's even a suggestion that, for example, not keeping up to date with the most recent science and that sort of thing could be seen as, just not being diligent. I think things like not following procedures or maybe not reporting results, that seems a little bit more obvious. But I want to get into because you raise a couple of interesting points. So one is and I'm just trying to imagine the scenario with Fred Zane, and he's doing this stuff. In somewhere I read that, for example, his coworkers had seen him perform some of his analysis, and they were baffled because they were like, "What the hell is he doing?" It's like, we don't see what's going on here. So there's an issue surrounding reporting somebody and the process of doing so, either to a professional organization or to your superiors in your organization. And also, for example, the being labeled as a snitch or a rat, those kinds of issues. And if you know that something happens and then you don't say something, what does that say about the organization or yourself and your colleagues?
Well, you can't keep this stuff quiet for long. It's bound to bleed out into the law enforcement, the public safety community. But you're quite right. It is a challenging issue of what to do when you see something in front of you and you don't know exactly what to do. We had a fellow in our firearms unit who is very well regarded. And one of the things that we routinely did was to check an individual's work. And on cases that were pretty close, the checker, the person who is looking at the primary investigator's work, had the notion, well, so-and-so is the senior member of this unit. He must know what was right. This is a match. And then the case goes to court and they have an outside expert take a look and he say, well, it's not a match. So we go back in our situation, we decided, I was lab director at the time, we decided, well, we have to do some digging to make sure that this was just a one-off, a problem that just happened this one time, and we could just comfortably say it was just one of those things, or is this a more common problem? So we started to call back some of his work, and these were serious cases. These were mostly murder cases. And we hoped like hell to not find any more problems, and of course we did. So we had to call back more cases, and we found more problems. Ultimately, we went back and redid all of the work that he had done over a period of a year or two. And the issue came down to, well, according to this Brady case I told you about earlier, the prosecution, knowing this information, had to go out and tell everybody. So they had to dredge up all the cases plus anything that this fellow worked on and send out letters saying that this individual had a major oops, and we needed to inform you, and you have to decide what you want to do about it. Make a long story short, there was nothing nefarious about this. The guy had an eyesight issue. He was in his 40s, and his eyesight wasn't quite what it was before, and I guess he may have not noticed it, or was too vain to get glasses. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it ultimately played itself out. But even from innocent situations, there can be some major problems that come up. There are instances where people see things and they're not sure what to do. Do I report them to my superior? Do I talk to the individual directly, call him or her on it, or just say nothing? Mm-hmm. And that's a big problem, because by saying nothing, you're condoning the behavior. It's likely to go on for a while longer, and heaven knows how many cases might be affected by that sort of error.
Mm-hmm. Do you know if any labs have a process in place for reporting unethical behavior or concerns, whatever that might be?
Most labs that are accredited, the current standard is something called ISO ISO 17025. That's an accreditation standard for analytical laboratories. And there's a requirement to report problems that the laboratory has uncovered through its quality assurance program to the appropriate parties, or at least make a notation in the case file if it hasn't moved forward. So it does exist, but it's unclear how rigorously it's followed. I'd like to think that most people take these things pretty seriously, but I couldn't tell you here that it's 100% followed or 98% followed. I just don't know.
Okay. There was a couple of mentions about ethics as part of the NAS 2009 report. And I think there were a couple of sections, maybe section 7 that talks about certification, and then section 9, which made a recommendation. I believe it was for a national code of ethics. And I'm curious, is there anything like that today? Has that been established?
There are some codes of ethics in professional organizations. Many of the forensic organizations, the professional forensic organizations, have codes of conduct. But you don't have to be a member of any of those organizations to adopt that kind of code. It occurred to me in thinking about our discussion today. There are many professions today that require the individual to take an oath, to swear to uphold the Constitution in the United States. Doctors, lawyers, for example, have that requirement. Police officers and they're sometimes called sworn officers, have to take an oath. Strangely, forensic scientists don't, even though they're handling material that could well result in a person's taking away a person's freedom, or in a capital case, which still exists here in the U.S. in some states, deal with his life. So that's curious. Of course, when you go to court and testify, you have to raise your right hand and swear to tell the truth and so forth. But that's the extent of this kind of ethical situation that you mentioned. It's spotty at best.
Yeah, that's interesting because so I'm a professional engineer. I'm registered here in the province of Ontario, Canada. And we had to do, I took a course on the ethics part, and then you have to write an exam on ethics. And so there are, I have to give them credit, because if someone misbehaves in the engineering community, they quite publicly go after the person. In fact, they publish it in the journals that they issue. And so it's not swept under the rug in any case. A lot of it has to do with misrepresentation, people claiming to be an engineer or something like that when they're not. But of course, in our case, it has more to do with public safety. If you're an architect, or if you're an engineer and you're building structures and things like that, ensuring that you're not cheaping out on materials and things like that become the issue. So it's a really interesting point that when we're dealing with people's lives, their freedoms, that we don't have an exam or even an oath or that sort of thing. It's something maybe to consider for the future in some of these organizations.
There's an interesting case that happened a number of years ago. There was a dentist, forensic dentist, down south. I think it may have been in Mississippi, and he was doing some off-the-wall stuff. And he was a member of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. He was dismissed from the academy for ethical complaints. When the defense brought this fact up in cases that he was involved with, they still let him. They still allowed him to testify. They ignored this situation. Now, this was a few. This was a good 20 years ago, I'm guessing, and I don't know if this is still a situation, but it has happened in the past.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that there are many situations like that. I wanted to ask you about during your tenure as president of the American Academy of Forensic Science. Did you ever run into a situation where you had an ethical complaint? And what is the process like? Because I believe there is a group in the Academy that's dedicated to ethical concerns. Is that true?
There's an ethics committee, and when a complaint is brought against a member, the ethics committee will first try to get all of the documents surrounding the particular case, investigate the case, talk to the individuals involved, and ultimately issue a report with recommendation to the board of directors, who then has to decide what to do with it. There are various sanctions that they can take, going from dismissal down to a finding of no ethical misconduct. It kind of brings to mind another a collateral problem with this process, because unlike your engineering situation where it's published, it is not published in the forensic community very widely. They may have a line in some newsletter that so and so was discharged from the Academy for ethical conduct, but it doesn't go into any serious issues. Now, does the laboratory, who is where this person works, who is aware of that, is the laboratory obliged to take any action about this individual? Should they limit his casework, send him back to training, send him to ethics courses? Do they have an obligation to advise the prosecution that there is a problem, that the prosecutor, in turn, under this Brady ruling, has to let the defendant know about? Now, it's probably a little more straightforward if the laboratory is part of a prosecution department, like the FBI is under the Justice Department, and many labs in the U.S. are under either the Attorney General's office or even the District Attorney's office. So there's a clear nexus between the laboratory and the prosecutor. But in a situation, say in a sheriff's lab, which is not part of a prosecutor's office, what needs to be done? And these are, I told you before, this is a lot of gray area, a lot of muddy waters to be concerned about. And as we develop more expertise in how best to deal with these things, we have a better sense of how to proceed.
Yeah. I guess the troubling part is when it's not gray, because sometimes there are things that you may hear, which, it's like, okay, somebody's in a dilemma, and, and maybe the issue at hand may not have a massive impact, but there are times where, in some of these, even some of the cases that we've seen, wrongful conviction cases, just, it's one thing when somebody uses the science of the time at the time to say something, and that's what they believed and that's what they were taught, and they're practicing what's best, and then later on maybe we discover something else. But I think a common thing that I see, that I guess you would say is could be questioned as unethical is when an expert gets on the stand and basically tries to oversell or overstate a particular piece of evidence. That seems to me to be probably one of the most common things that happens on the stand, and not showing where the limitations are, not showing where the mistakes may be, that type of thing. And it could be for whatever reason. Maybe they feel like they're acting as an advocate. Maybe they feel like they're trying to help the defense, or they're trying to help the prosecution. I've seen it on both sides. You brought up cognitive bias, and what if you're not aware of it, right? So if something is happening subconsciously, it means that you don't know that you're doing it, and so it's up to other people to point out, to tap you on the shoulder, and say, hey, you need to stand back from this and be careful. And I guess that's probably an important part of peer review too. But how important is ethics in terms of, for example, the American Academy of Forensic Science is probably an early adopter because they had this in their code, right? They've had a code of ethics for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how much bite some of these other organizations actually have in terms of ethics, and if they do anything about it, because I feel like the ethical part is the part that's swept under the rug. It's the part that is least talked about, maybe, or least addressed. And so I don't know if it's because people don't want to look bad, or people don't want to avoid confrontation. But where does somebody go to learn more? I mean, are there even courses in this, or is there a place where people get training for this sort of thing?
Well, these are programs that regularly pop up in professional programs dealing with ethics and other kinds of situations. I ran a program at ASCLD a few years ago, where I brought in lab directors who were faced with problems in their laboratories that in some cases were clearly ethical dilemmas, and how they did with it and what was the outcome. And I'll share with you my painful story. We had an employee who was dry labbing drug cases. The employee would run an infrared spectrum, which was stored in the device's computer memory, and then she would run the next case and just print out the same spectrum, just changing the annotation on the printed copy. We discovered this, took it to the appropriate authorities within the sheriff's department. We decided that there was a possibility of it being criminal in nature. You can't falsify evidence, that's a crime. And took it to the district attorney's office, who at some point opted not to do anything about it. The employee in question resigned. And then there was an investigation of the laboratory by my agency to see if this was a chronic problem or just one time only. The bottom line was that the decision was made that the fault lay at the feet of the lab director, me, because I wasn't taking adequate precautions or paying adequate attention to the lab staff, which was curious because I was the one who brought the problem forward as soon as I became aware of it. And the ultimate decision was I received time off without pay, and I was also effectively demoted, and they brought in a sworn officer, a captain, to be the titular, to be the actual head of the lab, where I was just the laboratory director in name only. So this is a problem of what happens after the problem is found out and dealt with? In this individual, in this particular case, we actually went back and redid all of the cases that the analyst had examined. We did, in my mind, everything that was appropriate, but I guess there was a need to find fault someplace, and yours truly was the individual who wound up being thrown under the bus.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just another piece of the pie that individuals have to be aware of. The other thing is, you mentioned earlier that people don't particularly like snitches. They don't like rats, and you run the risk of not being considered the hero in your organization, but the villain for raising the red flag about a perhaps well-loved coworker. So, as I said, lots of gray.
Yeah, no, for sure. What about why is it so difficult, for example, in cases where somebody is really, messing up and consciously misrepresenting evidence or whatever, equivalent to like a medical malpractice or something where there's a conscious decision being made to do something wrong. Why is it so hard to penalize these people? I mean, I realize that you can shame them, and organizations can shame them or whatever, but legally, if you've done something seriously wrong, there should be penalties for that. And I'm just wondering, why does the law not somehow coincide with the ethical part?
Well, first of all, somebody has to become aware that some problematic conduct has taken place. Sometimes it's under the radar and not directly observed. Other times it's fairly blatant. There are a couple of cases, one case in San Francisco, another case in, I believe it was Boston or someplace in Massachusetts, where there were problems with drug cases. Ultimately, the two examiners in these cases were convicted of evidence falsification, and not only did they forfeit their job, but they were sent to prison. So, but these kinds of cases are kind of few and far between. They don't happen all that regularly, and there's a variety of issues here. First of all, as you pointed out, and I've said in the past, that there are not such a high number of these cases out there compared to the hundreds of thousands of cases that crime labs across the country work on. You're talking about cases that you can count in one or two hands. So if they come to light and they have to be dealt with, then there's a decision of how to proceed. In the case that I referred to about the dry labbing case, the prosecutor looked at the case and studied it for several months and came to the conclusion that the issues were so complex that a jury would not be able to understand it and not be able to bring back a guilty finding because the complainant was saying that they'd never been properly trained in how to use the instrument and were using it the way they thought it was appropriate. And there was no way of really demonstrating that some sort of fraudulent activity was taking place. In the Zane case, we spoke earlier. The state's prosecutors did attempt to file charges against him, but because there was an issue of statute of limitation, they couldn't move it further. Typically, what happens is that in many cases, the person is drummed out of the profession because it's a serious black mark against them, which can be raised in trial. But in other cases, as in that forensic dentist case, didn't seem to matter. The prosecutor was willing to continue to use him, and what can I say?
Yeah, no, that can happen. I want to squeeze something in here, Barry, before I forget, and that is that you have a book it's in its 8th edition right now, no, it's not Ethics in Forensic Science. Let me get back up on that. Let me correct that. It's Techniques of Crime Scene Investigation. And what can you tell us about the book?
Well, the book, curiously, it was, I inherited it back in the 3rd edition. It was a very well-received book that was published by a couple of Swedish investigators. The publisher at the time was trying to get it upgraded. When I received a letter from the publisher asking a bunch of questions, I read between the lines and thought that they were looking to find another writer because the earlier ones probably were dead or retired. So I wrote a rather in-depth review of the book. Both I was teaching junior college at the time in this type of course, and I was working in a crime laboratory. So I approached it from both sides, and they said, "Gee, could you write this book for us?" So I did it for the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th edition. By the time the 8th edition came along, my son David, who had, as we like to joke, followed in the family business, he became a forensic scientist. I invited him to become a co-author. So it's you can see on the title page, it's Fischer and Fischer. So
Yes.
That's how that happened. But there is some mention in that book of some of the ethical issues that we've spoken during this discussion, and it's available for people to take a look at.
All right. Hey, I'm going to take a question here. There's a message from Chris Brown. He says, "Can Barry discuss how to insulate from or prevent various biases like confirmation and cognitive?" That's a whole other hour, but give us your condensed version.
Well, some have argued that in major cases there ought to be a 2-step process where there's a forensic scientist who is in the intake side, and then he distributes the case to a person who is kept totally in the dark and has no information about a case. The difficulty there is the cost. One thing you need to be able to do is to justify the cost. And I've often pointed out that we're in most police forces, the crime laboratory, the forensic science laboratory is a small pimple on the backside of a very large animal. And to go to the head of the agency and say, "Hey, boss, we need X number of more people to do this job," he's likely to say, "Well, how do you justify this? Can you give me any examples of how this is a problem?" Even though I recognize it and agree that it is a problem, the best you can do for the examiner and the laboratory is to recognize the existence of these types of biases, to try to limit as best you can them from occurring, to present that issue in court when it's being testified to, and to also say while testifying that I'm giving you all the good news, but there's some problem areas which the prosecution oftentimes doesn't want to bring up,
Right.
But here are some issues that a trier of fact, a judge or jury, might want to consider in determining how much value, how much weight this evidence has to be added to the case. Now, it's a juggling act because you don't want to, as a witness, you don't want to belittle the evidence that you're presenting to such a degree that the jury thinks, wow, this expert has so many problems with it, we can't give it any credibility.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, you don't want to be at the other end of the equation, like you point out, that you're giving it so much credibility that you put your thumb on the scale and make it difficult for somebody who has no information or idea about the subject matter to effectively deal with it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And like I said before, I think and it's a difficult situation to be in, because to communicate some of these concepts, if it's DNA and trying to get this stuff across to a layperson is not always simple. It's that you have to sometimes use very simple examples or analogies or that sort of thing. But maybe that's where there needs to be some better emphasis on witness testimony and practicing on how to get difficult concepts across. There's another question.
Well, the point that I've always made is you need to educate the defense bar. Defense attorneys have to be very well prepared to ask prosecution expert witnesses tough questions, pointed questions that they have to lay out to the jury.
Mm-hmm. So Barry, what is next for you? You're obviously working in a number of different areas. You do a lot of different things. I watch your posts and things like that. But what is your next big thing? Are you just new writing, new books, what are you working on?
Somehow I've with the pandemic, these podcasts have become very, very popular. And for whatever reason, I've been recently discovered in India. And I've given a good half dozen lectures on various topics. I have one coming up, which I'll be describing the future of forensic sciences. I have to put together my PowerPoint. I'll be up in a couple of weeks. So I seem to be lecturing quite a bit in far off places. I've done one virtual lecture in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, one in Malaysia, and several in India. I just gave a very short, fun talk at the Academy meeting. They have a bring your own slides section. It's meant to be light stuff, and that was, of course, virtually also.
Mm-hmm. There's just, if somebody wants to reach out to you, Jules here says, thank you for sharing and that you taught him a lot. Where can people reach out to you if they want to get a hold of you? If they got any questions or?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn at Barry AJ Fischer. I'm on also I tweet, and my email address is barryajfischer@gmail.com. Fischer is spelled Fisher.
Just do a search on Google. You'll find him. Trust me. He comes up all over the place.
I haven't seemed to come around to doing a website. So maybe if this pandemic continues on, it'll give me some new challenge to work on.
Yeah, for sure. Well, listen, Barry, I want to say thank you so much for joining. We're getting on in time here, so I think we'll cut it here. But we covered a lot of topics. It's a difficult subject to really discuss and get into simply because of it's so deep. But I think it is something that people need to consider. And I thank you for sharing, especially the examples that the personal experiences and examples, because some of them, people sometimes don't feel comfortable talking about them. So, hey, thank you very much for everything.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I hope at some point in the future that we can have you back on, maybe talking about a different subject, because I know you're multifaceted. You have a lot of different things you can talk about. So, and I think with your kind of experience, we can all benefit from it. All right, hang back there, and I'll be back here in a second. All right, folks. Well, that does it for this particular one. Next week, my guest is going to be a forensic psychiatrist with the OPP. His name is Peter Collins, and he's been with the OPP since 1995. He's also been a member of the crisis and hostage negotiation team for the Toronto Police Service Emergency Task Force. And so the topic next week is forensic psychiatry. So make sure that you're there next week. Don't remember, it's always Thursdays at 2 p.m. Eastern. So on that note, I want to say thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a good week. Bye-bye.